This week on the Futurists, Alex Tapscott. And then we get the band back together. You know, imagine being a kid in London and going on a school excursion down to Monument Station. You put your VR goggles on. Okay, class, put your VR goggles on. Let's see what it was like in 1666. And suddenly the London fire is on all around you, right? Like the impact of that event from an historical purpose would be entirely different. Well, guys, thanks for joining us. Later in the show, we do have Rob Tercek and Miss Metaverse joining us. We're going to chat about a little bit more about Web3. But before that, we had the opportunity a little bit earlier to record a show with Alex Tapscott over the launch of his new book, which is called Web3. So here's the interview I did earlier with Alex Tapscott on his new book. I'm your host, Brett King, and this week we have a returning guest, and it's exciting because he's got his brand new book out, so we get the opportunity to dive into that. He is the co-author and international best-selling author of Blockchain Revolution. Been on the show before, a good friend of the show. He's launching his new book, Web3, charting the internet's next economic and cultural frontier. Alex Tapscott, welcome.
Brett, it's a pleasure to be back.
And so how have you been, my friend? You know, we haven't caught up since the pandemic. How are things?
Well, things have been good. Fortunately, those were some slow years, so that not a lot was happening in the world of, Web3 or the world in general. So yeah, not a lot happened. In actuality, it's been a crazy 4 years. Probably since we last spoke, I had 2 kids, moved into a new house, and wrote a new book. So big changes happening underway in my world, for sure.
You got to keep that content coming, whether it's DNA based or paper based, right? So,
yeah, that's right.
So, where are you based these days?
So I'm based in Toronto, Canada. But as you well know, as someone who does a lot of speaking gigs, I travel around the world. Since the first book came out in 2016, I've traveled to, I think, 40 countries. Every continent except Antarctica. And that's been interesting for a lot of reasons. I mean, one, it kind of puts your home country in perspective, but also gave me a better appreciation for how globally distributed innovation around Web3 has been, and where certain areas are being leaders, or where the vanguard is happening. And it's happening in some surprising and sometimes unexpected kinds of places, like Thailand or Turkey, or Nigeria, or some of these other countries, and that's really opened my eyes more to just how global this all is.
Yeah, I think we might be having BitCub on the show in a couple of weeks.
Right on.
And the head of Binance in Thailand as well. So we're trying to organize that through the FinTech Association. So watch out for that one coming up soon. Sort of getting at that, actually, before we dive into some of the themes in the book. Who do you think are the geographical leaders in blockchain specifically?
Yeah,
because I've got my idea.
It's an interesting question, and it's one that everyone's asking. Where's the next Silicon Valley going to be, or where's the future Web3 hub? And in many ways, I think the next Silicon Valley won't be a place. It's not going to be one single geographical location. Silicon Valley was once called a tech Galapagos because of the unique blend of characteristics, talent, capital, universities, government R&D, big tech companies, and so forth. That led to the unique species of technology companies that kind of dominated the first era of the internet. And this time, I just think it's different. We're in a different era. In the 90s, as the first economic frontier of the web was being forged, like most of the internet connections were in the States. Half the world hadn't made a phone call. The economies of all these countries were far less developed than they are today. And now we live in a world where 3/4 of the population has a smartphone connected to the internet, and technology and talent and capital is way more distributed than ever. So where is this all going to happen? Well, I think the US is going to remain a leader despite all of these, forecasts.
Despite the best efforts of the SEC to destroy the industry.
Well, but despite all the bearish forecasts, and in spite of the SEC, what's so interesting about the U.S. is that Web3 can succeed in the U.S. in spite of government policy, not because of government policy. But in other parts of the world, it's the opposite. where if you're in, the UAE, for example, you need to try and create the conditions for that industry to succeed. And you need to lure people to come there, to set up businesses, to invest capital, and so forth. Because absent those incentives, those people may not choose that as their first vocation. Whereas people might choose to stay in Miami or San Francisco, even with a highly uncertain regulatory environment, for so many reasons, many of them business, but others cultural and social and so forth. And then there are sort of middle countries, countries like the United Kingdom, for example, or Canada, or Singapore, where we're seeing different kinds of approaches. Rishi Sunak, the prime minister in the UK, said when Andreessen Horowitz set up shop in London that he wanted to make the UK one of the Web3 capitals of the world. And I think probably that's sort of where we end up, not with one single place leading the way, but with different nodes doing different things. So the US will remain the biggest. Like I know people try to zag on that, but I just can't imagine a world where that's not the case.
Yeah.
But then I also see there's a lot more interest out of East Asia. And I think that hubs around like places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Seoul are going to be leaders in this respect. And then there's the question of, are we talking about leadership in terms of company formation, or company or network formation, investment, and so forth? And then are we talking about usership? And when it comes to usership, that's going to be far more distributed and far less spiky. Like, I don't think it's going to be concentrated in any single location. Chainalysis does really good work on this, and they point out that a lot of countries where adoption of stable coins or Web3 gaming is highest is in places you may not expect initially, right? You may expect places, developed Western countries, quote unquote, to be where people are adopting these tools, but in fact, it's the opposite. And a lot of
I'm surprised you haven't said China yet, or Dubai. Well, Dubai's a fairly obvious
I did.
one,
I said the UAE. So
UAE, right? Yeah, you did say
so
that.
Dubai,
Sorry, my apologies.
No, I would include Dubai in that group of countries that is making an aggressively trying to lure companies and talent and capital so that they can sort of like brute force their way into becoming a leader.
Yes.
Right?
No, that's very much Dubai's way of things.
Yeah. The Chinese thing is much more complex. I think that it's clear that as a country, look, they've had tailwinds for 40 years, and now they have headwinds, right? There's demographic headwinds. The economy is slowing down. They haven't gone like a middle income country yet.
Oh, we can get into this debate, brother. This is a debate I'm having online right now, and I'm actually having it with my co-host for the Futurists, Rob Tercek, because I have a slightly different view on the economy of China, and we should get into that offline. But the reason I said China is we just saw Shanghai announce that they're launching a digital asset register for Shanghai built on the blockchain. All of the biggest banks in China all have blockchain integrated cores now. WeBank, which is the biggest digital bank in the world, has a blockchain core. And I don't know of any other sort of market level infrastructure that runs on blockchain like that does in China. So, I think operationalizing of blockchain, I think they've done very well. Obviously, when we start talking about other aspects of the Web3 world, metaverse, NFTs, DAOs, and so forth, that gets a lot murkier because of the whole CBDC stablecoin, token issues in China, which I get. But just pure blockchain, I think they've done some interesting things.
Without a doubt. And I think that's an important distinction. It's the old expression, right? Capitalism with Chinese characteristics. That's how they like to describe their, there's a market economy, but there's a strong state and, single party, and that kind of controls everything. So it's a different system. And I think in a way we're looking at blockchain with Chinese characteristics as well, or Web3 with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah.
One of the benefits, one of the many benefits of this technologies, it gives you a way to move and store value peer-to-peer, and to do so, permissionlessly, cross-border, between individuals big and small at relatively low cost. And a lot of those things would be attractive to to the Chinese government and to the corporate establishment, but some of those things may not be, right? And so I think they're looking at ways to take some of the benefits, real-time settlement, immutable records, smart contracts that can automate business processes, all that kind of technology stuff, and develop it in a way that suits the needs of the state. And you could say the same thing maybe for other countries who also are looking to, regulate this technology in a way that suits their needs, and that's fine too. But I think the Chinese example is definitely unique in that respect. Now, in terms of like where the country is today and why it might be pivoting, well, if the U.S. is closing the door on something, China may want to open a window and try and become a center for innovation in a technology arena that is going to be, in my opinion, one of the key disruptors for the next sort of 20 years.
Well, not only does China have to court foreign direct investment, which has done quite well. It has more foreign direct investment than the U.S. today. But it has to solve the demographic crash, right? I mean, the US will have to solve that in the 2040s as well. But, China, has to deal with the fact that they've long been very skeptical of immigration from a cultural perspective, mainly.
Yeah, like the U.S. could solve that problem with a snap of the fingers if there's political will. It's like Canada, where I live, our natural growth rate's been below replacement for 30 years.
Right, but Canada has a huge immigration program.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's what's maintained Canada's economy for so long. It's it's also, despite the fact that in Australia we have very much the same sort of conversation about immigration as Americans do. Australia would be half the size it is today without immigration. So, and that has a clear economic impact. So anyway, let's jump into some of the book. We're talking about Web3 today, but of course, Web3 and the technologies involved in this are building blocks of the smart world. I talk about the concept of smart economies, right? Highly autonomous economies, in the 2040s and 2050s. And to do that, we need these technologies. We need stable coins, CBDCs, cryptocurrencies. We need a way to digitize assets. So, early examples of that with NFTs and tokens and so forth. We need portable identity systems, that are immutable and secure. But probably the biggest development we're going to see, Harvard's been writing about this recently, is the emergence of autonomous corporations, right? And we are seeing the early examples of that today with DAOs. Despite the fact that the first DAO on the Ethereum network was a bit of a disaster, this is clearly the way we're going. But what can you tell us about how you think that sort of this autonomous organization or componentized organizations might develop around this sort of autonomous technology?
Well, first off, I love that framing that you just provide of what the world might look like in 2040. Yeah, we have to imagine an environment where there are billions of people, companies, autonomous AI agents, smart devices, and new kinds of organizations, as you're describing them, all needing to transact, to establish trust, to build wealth, to organize capability peer-to-peer. And that's not going to happen with the existing financial infrastructure or even with existing technology platforms. We need a new operating system, which includes, I think, all those things that you just mentioned. So totally in agreement with you there. DAOs are a fascinating part of this whole story. So, for your listeners, DAOs is distributed autonomous organization or decentralized autonomous organization, depending on how you ask. And basically they are in, I would say, digitally native organizations comprised of token holders, all working towards some kind of collective action or some sort of end goal. So DAOs can be the organizing structure for new kinds of software applications. So in DeFi, for example, a lot of projects basically incentivize usership through tokens. So the earlier you are to something, the more you contribute, the bigger a share of the application or platform you can own. And as a result, instead of a cap table with shareholders, you have token holders who have both ownership and governance rights. And there are lots of advantages to that. If you're building a software project from scratch and it's meant to live on the internet, and it's meant to be, permissionless, to allow anyone to access it regardless of where they are, then the ownership structure that you put in place needs to be similarly global in nature. So Silicon Valley is known for a long time that in order to attract the best people or attract people at all, you need to provide incentives, ownership incentives.
Right.
And that's why, there's always been this sort of cliche of very generous stock options being paid to early employees. So DAOs kind of start with the same premise, where if you're early to using an application, the more people that join, the more useful that application becomes. You've helped to build the network effects. You've helped to create something more useful, and you should own a piece of it. So in DeFi, something like a decentralized exchange, if you're providing liquidity, the more liquidity there is in assets on an exchange, the more useful that exchange is. It doesn't matter that an exchange has 500 things you can buy. If there's no volume in those things, then it doesn't really matter, right? So that's one example. And the difference, though, with DAOs is that they can do it globally. So if you wanted to incentivize users all around the world using conventional method, like, say, I don't know, like a restricted stock unit or a stock option, you would have to create legal agreements in 50 different countries, translate contracts into a dozen different languages, all to just create the incentive for people to earn a share of something over time. And with a DAO and with a token rather than equity, you can do that much more simplistically. Now, that's the promise of DAOs from an ownership perspective. The other thing that's really interesting is governance. So if internet users are going to become internet owners of the applications and services that they use, then they may have some say in how that thing is run. And that's an area of DAOs that right now is revealing, and I think, some of the problems with self-governance, with governance in general, which is that, you may have a bunch of token holders, but many of them don't vote, they don't participate. And as a result, small cabals of people are able to, shape the direction of organizations, which I should add is quite similar to how it works in corporate, like proxy voting. Right. Oftentimes there's very few participating shareholders in a lot of important votes. And it's oftentimes big institutional shareholders that sway the direction of those kinds of things.
This is all managed. You talk a lot about the consensus elements here, but the reality is that once those contracts between the different parties are put in place, essentially this business is run by an algorithm, or this component of the business is run by an algorithm. Is that an accurate assessment? I
would say like the business processes part of of what it does are run by algorithms, smart contracts, but the governance is done in a very human way. Where, it may be that tokens help allow you to vote on matters, but it's still people, and like people talk to people. So, you can find out who the other token holders are, and they can, agree to vote in a certain way. So this is
consensus sets policy, which defines process, which is encoded. Right? That's
right. Yeah.
And the measurement or the performance of that policy, at the in sense of the operation is in terms of tokens.
Yeah, that's correct. And I just think that like the thing I'm describing right now is not a reason why DAOs are a bad idea. It's just an implementation challenge, which is the idea of incentivizing users of an application through ownership and making sure that everyone who's contributing value has a piece of the upside. It's a very important and very powerful part of the Web3 thesis. But the practice of ensuring good governance is something that has a human element. And that
we are going to have to get better at figuring out, particularly as more and more of our business is running code, is automated. We're going to have to figure out how to govern, that sort of black box function, particularly if there's elements of generative elements of AI, where it starts off doing, doing approaches to execute on the core mission of the contract, but not according to the process we may have defined at the start, because it thinks it can do it a more efficient way, or it just finds, it doesn't think, but it finds more efficient patterns in terms of how to do trades or whatever it might be. I think it's interesting. I do think that, I think what the Web3 community probably undersells is the fact that every corporation in the 2050s, every leading corporation in the 2050s is going to be highly autonomous, right? Or have highly autonomous elements to it. So we have to look at this as, if people are dismissive of the DAO, then they have to be dismissive of that future as well, which isn't reasonable. So even if you don't agree with the DAO, you have to see it as an experimentation and a stepping stone to the way we have to think about corporations in the future and regulations about governing corporations that are highly autonomous. We don't have laws in place that defines a corporation without office holders, for example, but we may not have a CFO function. We will for now, but in 30 years we may not need a CFO function in terms of oversight or fiduciary duty of the algorithmic entity. It's very interesting, right?
Well, you can explore, you can tease that out a little bit further. So if more and more organizations are like DAOs and more of their transactions are happening on chain, or all their transactions are happening on chain, then you've created an immutable, transparent record of their finances. And so you don't need a CFO, or at least you don't need accountants to prove that transactions occurred,
right?
Because you have an immutable record that everyone can see and trust.
Well, you can also have another algorithm that audits it.
Yeah,
right.
That's well, of course, and this is the intersection of AI and Web3, right? Which is that you have this process, this economic.
Now we're getting into it.
This way to manage transactions and contracts and to build trust, and then you have this intelligence engine on top of it that can take that and interpret it and build like value-added services using that, right? Yeah. And I think that's where we also see the intersection of AI and Web3. I just want to say one thing before we move on, which is that I think right now all of these technologies people are viewing as distinct technologies, whether it's AI or IoT or VR and AR or blockchain and so forth. But I think in much the same way as the term internet expanded from its original kind of definition to describe our whole era that includes many technologies, business models, social behaviors, etc. This term Web3, I think, is evolving to describe an era that is composed of a group of different technologies. Now, I'm not trying to slide AI into
but I think
the conversion.
A lot of what we're doing,
really important.
A lot of what we're doing, particularly when we start talking about digital assets and decentralized finance, and the blockchain, is we are trying to create a structure that's machine readable, right? Mm-hmm. The digital twin concept and so forth. This is so the world of AI can recognize, the utility and the products and services and elements that we have in society, so it can work with them. So it's all, in my view, you can't talk about Web3 without talking about artificial intelligence, and you can't talk about how AI is going to be integrated into society without talking about Web3. I think they're, as you say, they're quite complementary. Yeah. Now, I do want to get into the book, dude, because, that's why we brought you on this week. You've got the book out. But so I want to talk about identity in a moment. But first of all, obviously the book is called Web3. It's just come out this week. It's I'm sure, I haven't checked today, but I'm sure it's on the bestsellers ranking already. But I talk about the journey for you in terms of the timing of this, because you could have talked about Web3 5 years ago, but why is now the right timing for a book like this? Is it because it's critical mass, or?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I've been thinking about the idea for some time. The term Web3 is not new. It was coined in 2014, but there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I thought that in 2021, 22, while all this innovation was happening, there was a lot of confusion about what Web3 was and what it wasn't. And I actually think that the events of last year, like the collapse of FTX and Terra Luna and some of these other high-profile projects, had sort of thrown new mud on the windshield and clouded people's views even further, and sort of hastened my sense of urgency to actually get out and write this book. So my objective with the book really is to reset the conversation about Web3, to help people understand some of the enduring sort of themes and concepts around this technology and why it's important. You mentioned we're hopping into the book. We've kind of been talking around a lot of the themes.
Well, we've been talking about already. The theme of the book, for sure. Yeah.
And we've touched on a couple. We've talked about assets and organizations. So the way that the book is kind of structured is that we look at Web3, what it is, how it works, and so forth, and then we look at the key transformations. What does this mean for assets? What does this mean for people, internet users? What it means to be a person online? How it impacts organizations? What it means for different industries, including financial services, but also gaming, infrastructure, et cetera. How this is going to intersect with other technologies like AI and the metaverse, and then what this means for civilization. And then we look at the path forward and give some key takeaways. So each one of those transformations, assets, people, organizations, industries, basically you can think of as bigger and bigger concentric circles. I think the asset is the most important part of this, or it's the foundational primitive or building block of Web3, the idea that we have a way to express ownership of a digital good online, and we have a way to move and store it and use it and manipulate it, to me is the big sort of kernel, the big starting point. But what this means for people, I think, is equally profound. So in Web 2, we entered into this Faustian bargain unwittingly. I don't think people consciously did this, but basically the trade was you would give access to your information and data and time and so forth to these big platforms. And in exchange, you would be provided with a free service like search or social networking or so forth. And initially, this seemed like a good trade because these platforms in the early days were fun and they were novel and they were useful. And the data didn't seem all that valuable. But I think what we've realized is that if someone else is capturing all of our data and using all this information, it means we can't monetize it. It might end up in the wrong hands. So one of the really interesting things—
Can you hear that?
Web3 is the idea of a self-sovereign identity, the idea that an individual can own their own data and own their own digital goods, and can decide how they're used, where they're used, and whether they get compensated for it. And I think that each of those different concepts is really important. So the Web2 model is a kind of digital feudalism, right? Where you provide all this data in exchange, you get access to something like free services, like some cabbages or something from the Lord. And with this new model, we have a different one where it's a citizen-centric identity where you own and control all these different aspects of you and your life, and you decide how they're used. So there's a relationship here to tokens. It's Vitalik Buterin, who's the creator of Ethereum, has talked a lot about soul-bound tokens. This idea that we could have a non-fungible, non-transferable token that's programmed to gather data about us over time. And that becomes something that we can passport from country to country. We can use it to improve how we access government services, healthcare. We can improve how we access financial services through reputation-based credit scoring. All of these different things are part of a rich digital identity that you as a user, you as the individual, could get to control. And that, more than anything, is a really profound shift in how we think about our relationship to technology and to the web.
That's it's great. I mean, it's always good to get a new book out. I know how tough it is to write a book, and this is one that's pretty complex, and to make the complex simple, it takes a lot of time. You first of all have to have a deep understanding of each of these areas. So, I'm looking forward to getting a copy of it this week and checking it out. But for those that are, joining us here and listening, where can they find the book?
Yeah, the book is available for wherever books are sold. Amazon, Borders, in the UK. If you have listeners, it's available there. We also have several foreign rights that we've sold already, so it will be available in Korean, Thai, simplified Chinese, Brazilian, Portuguese so far, and we're expecting a lot more translations. For those who can buy it in North America and the UK, the best way to buy the book is in massive volume. For yourself, your friends, your family,
dude,
for everyone.
New York Times, here we come. No, it's tough, man. It's tough. I've tried a couple of times. I've got close, but about 18,000, these
New York
days.
Times,
but anyway.
New York Times is the holy grail. But you know what? You don't have to be a New York Times bestseller to have a book that...
No, but, you're going to get on the top of the Amazon lists and stuff as well. So, but listen to this. This is a quote from the back page of the book. And I'm envious because I tried to get this. I tried to get this for Technosocialism, my last one. This is the quote. With Web3, Tapscott has captured the zeitgeist. We are on the brink of an extraordinary new era where technology can reimagine everything. With clarity of thought and deep insight, this book explores Web3's immense potential. Guess who wrote that? Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple. What a fantastic testimonial, dude.
Yeah, thank you. I was
Yeah. It's a
humbled
good
and
get.
surprised by
Yeah,
that.
no, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Because, my agent knows his agent. We tried to get him and he was just, at the time, I think he was sick or whatever, but I'll make that excuse. But yeah. Well done. Check it out. Web3, charting the internet's next economic and cultural frontier. Alex, how can people get in touch with you if they want to know more about what you're doing?
Yeah, please connect with me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Follow me on Twitter and connect on LinkedIn. So at Alex Tapscott on Twitter, and then just Alex Tapscott, I think I'm on LinkedIn. Pretty
Yeah.
responsive. So please get in touch. And yeah, check out the book.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, that was fun. It was good to see. Alex is obviously still a believer in the Web3 stuff and the blockchain stuff. So let's take a quick break. After the break, there's going to be more Web3 goodness when Rob Tercek and Miss Metaverse and I get together. We'll be right back after this break. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurists podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, welcome back. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek, and now we're joined by Miss Metaverse, Katie, the king of the Metaverse, and of course, Brett. Hi, Brett. Chiming in a little bit late here, but thanks for bringing us that segment from Alex Tapscott. Good to see the Tapscott clan is still cranking out the books about blockchain. They have a minor industry making those books. Right on, though, it's cool to see that there's still signs of life in the Web3 area. I'm a fan. I'd like to see it gather even more.
I was just in Dubai, and it's still they just had the World Blockchain Summit there, and there was tons of people in town. Brock Pierce was there. Who's the guy that runs London Real, Katie?
Oh, Brian Rose.
Yeah, Brian Rose was there.
What?
I mean,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was really interesting. There was a bunch of futurists in town. I mean, they had Jitex on as well. But blockchain is still, especially in the Dubai ecosystem, has still got, getting a lot of attention.
And even things like NFTs here in Los Angeles, there's an NFT community that's still alive and kicking. It's mostly artists, I should say. But I actually kind of like that. The crypto crowd is not really my crowd, the money people.
Right.
I'm more interested in creative people. And they're less interested in, making a ton of cash or cashing in on a boom. What they are interested in is bringing creativity into this idea. And the concept of ownership and even decentralized ownership or distributed ownership of art assets is an interesting space. Like, that's a creative space. You're seeing this sort of injection.
This is funny because, you're talking about Web3, i.e. the metaverse. And I was talking about Web3, i.e. the blockchain, but actually they're two slightly different definitions of Web3, right? Because when we talk about metaverse, we're talking about the 3D web, right? But when we talk about blockchain, we're talking about version 3 of the internet. That's how they classify Web3. It took me a while to get my head around this, actually, because they're both talking about Web3, but the blockchain crowd see Web3 definition very differently, which is the decentralized internet, which leads to all these other things like decentralized currency and so forth. So I know many people listening will already know that, but I think it was important to make that distinction when we talk about Web3, right?
That's right. And those are important concepts because let's face it, right now, the web that we have is not just highly centralized, it's terrible. I mean, candidly, when's the last time you had a great experience using Google search or searching for anything on Amazon? These dominating platforms have become cluttered with so much crap. They're over monetizing us, they're tracking us, they're force feeding us stuff we don't necessarily want. There's a book out by Cory Doctorow now where he talks about the enshittification of the web. And his message is really very simple, but it's actually a good point, which is that the platforms always begin by attracting users. And they borrow money from the capital markets because they have access, so they can scale that up. They get a lot of users. Then they turn around and they change the system so that it favors the suppliers or the people who are selling stuff, which could be marketers or, in the case of Amazon, merchants. And then they give a favorable treatment to them until they're locked in. And once they've got both sides locked in, then they start to over monetize and spam the heck out of us with unwanted ads and other clutter. And so he calls that process enshittification. He points out that it's happened to search, it's happened to social media, it's happened to online shopping, and it's even happening to TikTok at this point. I think he makes a good point. This is the consequence
of commercialization,
these huge platforms. So can we break free? Well, that's the hope. That's the promise of Web3, the decentralized web. And candidly, I'm a fan. Like, I like that idea just because I find it exhausting to deal with all the clutter in the regular, the big centralized sites.
Right. And also too, you have people, worried about, even people worried about engaging with the AIs, like ChatGPT, there's people who are really upset because, the earlier versions had better quality results, and as things get messed with, for various reasons, you get different versions. You have no control over that, whereas back in the day, you had one version of software maybe every year and, you could hold on to it. But obviously that is a long time thing in the past.
Even in the AI space, you're quite right. Look, there was a frenzy of innovation just 6 months ago, but now we're starting to see it solidify around the same big companies. So AWS has launched a very ambitious project, which is to attract companies, enterprises, to their cloud service using AI. And they've got a variety of different foundation models that you can plug in. So that makes it very convenient and easy. But it starts to look an awful lot like a roach motel, which is easy to check into and hard to check out of. What they'd like to try to do is get you to put your whole business on the cloud, start to integrate those AI tools. And once you've migrated your whole business process over, it'd be really hard to switch out. Now, Microsoft's doing the same thing with Azure, and Google's doing the same thing with Google Cloud. So this starts to look like, the kind of rat trap or roach motel of the web. One more attempt by these big companies to centralize and to get companies, partners hooked on their platform. So that's the bait and switch. We're seeing that one more time. I mean, I think the whole world's caught on to this technique now, and we're kind of exhausted. The wild card with AI, though, is the open source models, of which there's now thousands.
They're
improving
you
quickly.
can spin up your own LLM today in the garage, or
on your iPhone. Yeah,
that's
right.
Exactly.
So, So that's a space for some great creativity. But, in a way, that's an illustration of the point we're just making, which is the innovation happens in a decentralized way, at least the innovation that favors users. So there's been some news. Actually, we've had quite a lot of discussion around this. Brett, a second ago, you were talking about how this dovetails with the metaverse. Of course, that's a topic we've had a number of different people come on the show to talk about. And there's been some news. Tony Parisi was on our show earlier. He was at Lamina One. Lamina One's doing great. He's moved on to something else at this point. But I just saw news today that Neil Stephenson, the guy who coined the term back in 1993, they have now launched Lamina One as a decentralized ecosystem for building interoperable metaverses. So the principle here is actually quite
the oasis.
Yeah, the idea is it's not like the metaverse will be one company building a kind of 3D Disneyland that you go to as a destination. That was kind of the Facebook idea. Even Facebook back in the day when they were pushing this idea, even they said there will be many different metaverses. Well, that's what Lamina One is seeking to build. They built a decentralized ecosystem for building metaverses. Anyone can build one. It's totally open. They already have 50,000 beta users developing on a platform. And they've got systems for decentralized identity, decentralized asset storage and asset exchange, tools like game engines to help you build 3D worlds. And the whole thing's built on top of the Avalanche blockchain, which is a very fast blockchain. That's always been an issue in the past. Blockchains are slow and throughput. So there's some news from one of our previous guests. And next week, I'm going to be seeing Wolf Kahl. You might remember early in our show. He was one of the first people we interviewed. Wolf is an expert in decentralized governance and instant governance. Yes, so we talked about DAOs way back, and I think it was like episode number 4 of our show. Well, I'll be visiting with him and the Minnesota Blockchain Association on Monday. What we're going to talk about is endemic corruption.
Basketball team.
Yeah,
sorry,
not the Timberwolves, the blockchain,
the Minnesota blockchains. Yeah, sorry.
So we're going to talk about endemic corruption. The world, the world that we're in right now, and particularly in the United States, we have, it's not just big tech companies. Big companies dominate just about every category. About 75% of the U.S. economy is dominated by a handful of companies, 3 or 4 big firms. So if you think of it, like we have only 4 major airlines. We only have a couple choices in operating systems for mobile phones. We have a couple of mobile operators. You have usually one choice of broadband provider and so on. And we see this across the board. It's not just telecommunications and transport. It's also true in food. Most of the food that we buy is produced by about 10 companies in the US. So this concentration, call it an oligopoly or cartelization of the US economy, in a weird way, that's like a centralization, very similar to the kind of centralization we see on the web. So on Monday, we'll be talking a little bit about that with the blockchain group. Like, how can we decentralize the existing economy? Nice challenge.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, there's a lot happening in the space. There's talk of new ETFs in the Bitcoin space. People like Gemini have been trying to do that for a long time. So if we can finally get an ETF through the SEC, that'll be big news, considering how harsh the SEC has been towards crypto in recent times.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you guys saw the news that last week Binance dropped carrying US dollars.
Wow.
In their ecosystem because it's just too much trouble with the SEC. So it's pretty crazy that it's been that combative, given the amount of wealth that it's created in the US. The whole crypto community, right? So,
well, and also
it's new world versus old stuff, right?
Yeah, and the promise of innovation, right? Our regulatory agencies aren't supposed to get in the way of regulation, and it looks like the SEC is putting itself firmly in the path of progress.
Yeah.
There's no doubt we need regulation. There's no doubt, there's been enough scandals and enough scams, particularly in crypto,
SBF,
where they seem to crank out a scam every week or so. Sure, yeah, we can talk about Sam Bankman-Fried. That. Unfortunately, because it's about money.
That Sam bankrupt fraud? Sorry.
Yeah, you got it.
Bankrupt fraud. No kidding. Yeah. Actually, bringing up the FCC, it's kind of interesting, too, because it seems that they're really trying to move along the metaverse in terms of devices. I believe just recently, the FCC gave the U.S. green light to use speedier 6 gigahertz frequency for low power wearables. VR and AR devices. So hopefully this will be meaning that
so specific spectrum.
Yes, exactly. So obviously there's some big plans coming in, and I think with all the hype about Metaverse 2.0, we should be seeing more soon. So it's exciting stuff.
Good. Well, it's important to make sure those devices can operate fast. Particularly for augmented reality, you need those overlays to line up exactly, precisely on point. If you turn your head or something, if there's a little bit of a lag, not only does it wreck the illusion, it actually can make you seasick. You kind of get nauseous if it happens. So low latency is going to be extremely important for those wearable devices. And there've been quite a few. There's a new RayBan Facebook collaboration.
Yeah, the Meta glasses. Yeah,
I saw that.
I was just going to talk about that actually. Have you got a pair yet, Rob?
No, I haven't.
We have to get.
I haven't. I'm waiting for the Vision Pro, man. That's gonna be my augmented.
Yeah, that's true.
But don't call it AR, call it spatial computing, because the jargon has moved on. We don't talk about the metaverse anymore.
Well, the first time I heard that term was from Scoble, actually. Which it makes sense, right? He's the guy in that space. But remember that book he did with Shell Israel years ago on spatial computing?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I'm convinced that this is a thing. I know there's a ton of hype, and it always seems like a perpetual dawn. We hear about these technologies that haven't quite arrived, they haven't quite matured, but progress is being made. I think for the folks who are listening, who are skeptical, who have heard this story before, remember that hardware is hard, and moving an entire gigantic ecosystem like the web to something new is a big undertaking, particularly when you're doing it in the face of the most powerful and rich companies on the planet. They do not welcome this. So you're running into resistance there. And then add to it things like, the Securities and Exchange Commission setting up roadblocks, making it difficult for companies to progress. All those things together make it a very tough uphill slog, which is one of the reasons why Web3 is taking a bit longer than people had hoped.
But we do have precedents for, these types of step change technologies taking quite a while to break through. I mean, we've got Google Glass was the early prototypes and stuff. So you can even go back to that. But I was thinking, this week I was talking about, autonomous vehicles. And a few years ago, we used to say, oh, we'll have self-driving cars before we'll have flying cars. But actually, we now have these flying vehicles that are starting to operate around the world based on basic drone technology, and they're not exactly what we thought of as a flying car back in the day. But we're seeing rapid progress in that area now. But it took a long time for that technology to actually find the right tech to make it viable. And there's a little bit of that with the metaverse in that, the quality of the glasses and the ability to not just create virtual worlds that you can disappear into, but that we see these computing devices as everyday devices. That's going to be the game changer. So that's really the wearable smart glasses, augmented reality stuff that does the real-time translation, does real-time image recognition, that you can project a screen, but that's wearable. Now, Vision Pro is getting closer to that, but you're not going to wear Vision Pro around on the street, right? We need a few generations of that technology to get to really mass market, where then I think just the coolness of a device like that will lead to clear adoption. That's sort of my view of it.
The Vision Pro is a pretty significant step forward. I mean, that's
absolutely. Yeah. It's going to make it, it's going to get developers into that, right? And so that's the real thing you also need for success of the metaverse, is having those really cool applications on top of that. And it's an entirely new programming competency. It's an entirely new design language, right? So we need a ton of developers to continuously get into this space before we get really compelling experiences in that. I mean, if you remember the first iPhone, right? The 2G iPhone. Yeah, you had a few apps and stuff on it, but you don't have anywhere near the experiences you have today.
Yeah, that's true. Look, that's the hardest developer program in the world to get into, Vision Pro. Everybody I know is trying to get their foot in the door there. I keep seeing my friends posting their credentials. Like, I got accepted into that program.
Oh, wow.
Because people perceive that that's going to be a significant step forward. But, let's give credit to Facebook because, or to Meta, I should say. Mark Zuckerberg has been seriously committed to this space. And he's put $40 billion to work on building out metaverse equipment, not just, the infrastructure, but also the hardware.
This is it. I mean, they are making progress towards that. You now have smart glasses that can do real-time translation of language and stuff like that in your field of view. I mean, this is pretty cool tech.
Well, acquiring Oculus is really key in all that, I mean, if Facebook didn't end up taking Oculus, I think it would have been a totally different scenario, in my opinion. And a lot of people even use the Meta Quest and all that these days because, they still tie it in with the original Oculus brand rather than Meta itself. And, but we'll see what happens. I mean, Horizon Worlds got kind of a bad rep, in the beginning, but I think more people are slowly adopting more and more. And I know even just from my experience, I see more people hopping on and, adding me as a friend on Oculus and Meta, so it's showing there's more growth. There's more people out there. It's a good thing.
Yeah, and the new glasses go off in a different direction as well. And I'm sure we're going to see these worlds. I see these worlds sort of come together. I do see at some point that, the operating systems we build for the VR world, a lot of that will cross over into AR, the competencies. The only difference really is sort of putting interfaces into the world in context, when you've got AR versus VR. So the sort of early stuff we've seen, like being able to project a, Minecraft game, 3D world onto a, tabletop surface with HoloLens and things like that. We see a little bit of that, but, that's really rudimentary stuff compared with what we're going to see with amazing apps integrated into the world around us with AR.
Yeah, so a heads up just as you walk around town, you'll see sorts of data overlays. So right now, I think the way to look at this is there's a kind of a foot race between Apple and Meta. So Apple's going to launch Vision Pro sometime next year. Meta has about a year then to start to really solidify their base before people start to switch out and migrate to Apple. At least that's the fear, right? Apple's price point is super high. When you add it all up with taxes, it's about $4,000 per
I don't know,
unit.
dude. You know, it's like saying when iOS came out, it killed Android. You know, it's like I'm not sure that we're going to it's all or nothing one way or the other. I think, you know, just like I think you're going to get different crowds of people with different preferences potentially.
And the two are going to propel each other forward, right? So competition is good for users. We get better devices. So Meta's going to try to come up in quality step by step. Each step is more difficult than the last one. And then Apple will try to step down in terms of price point. And somewhere, you know, eventually they'll be on the same wavelength and we'll have a choice of two. Exciting times ahead. So there we have it. Web3 intersecting with the metaverse and evolving into something that might be the future of the web. I'm keenly excited to see it.
Me too.
Beautiful. Katie, what do you use Oculus for? What do you like it for? Do you use like VR chat?
You know, earlier on I did, you know, there was like a lot of like virtual clubs and stuff like that, which I found kind of interesting. And being able to kind of like watch movies with someone, you know, I think it's kind of cool. You can share like a screen. It's like you have your own virtual movie theater. And there's also a bunch of other interesting things you could do. You know, I'd like to see more. There's a lot of games. People are talking about quite a few games that have just come out recently. They're starting to look a little bit better. Earlier on, there were more like really short experiences. Now they're becoming more of a full-on game, which is exciting. So hopefully we'll see more immersion, more people socializing and whatnot. But it still has some ways to go. But I'd say overall, I think we're getting there. We're pretty close. So it's looking up.
You have this experience when I do a VR thing, I remember it. Like it stays in my memory in a way that watching a movie or looking at a book or something doesn't stay with me. It's weird. It's almost like a dream where you kind of
I used to when I was playing Half-Life, you know, on Oculus. You so very quickly immersed in the environment, and you know, like it's very different to a typical gaming experience because you believe you know your brain partially believes you're in that environment, you know, and it's not as natural, the movement and so forth. But so when you take the glasses off, it's sort of like you have to readjust to the reality of the room and things like that. I'm not running through corridors having face huggers chase me, you know, like.
Well, that's why the Vision Pro is cool because you can dial it down. You can sort of dial down. You can choose which level of reality you want to, you want to be in, the real one or the virtual one. You know, it's also why VR training is so effective. We tend to overlook that, but that's the second biggest category for VR after games. And it makes a good deal of sense, right? If you think about how the way we train employees today, almost always it's going to be a series of really bad videos followed by some really poorly laid out clickable screens, right? That's usually how you do employee training. Everyone's done those compliance training things. They're terrible. But if you do employee training in VR, it's almost like a lived experience. Like you really have it embodied in you and you remember it. And because you are moving your hands around in a space and, you know, picking up things and moving them and so forth. It's impossible to forget. It's as impossible to forget as if you did it yourself. And from the brain's perspective, it's the same, right? So you're interacting with a virtual world feels to the brain just like interacting with the real world.
I've got an example.
Training.
Yeah, I've got an example that I used in Augmented. So this was back in 2015. I said, you know, imagine being a kid in London and going on a school excursion down to Monument Station, you know where the monument is in London. You put your VR goggles on. Okay, class, put your VR goggles on. Let's see what it was like in 1666. And suddenly the London Fire is on all around you, right? Like the impact of that event from an historical purpose would be entirely different, you know? This really has the potential to change our education significantly, I'm sure.
I think so too. And like, you know, in a physics class, they could take you inside of a molecule so you can actually see it because the models we have for molecules are terrible. Like the representations we have today that we teach with, they're not really accurate. Katie, I stepped on you. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. And it's actually funny you mentioned the molecules. A friend of mine is actually developing a VR educational platform to help people, to educate both those in the medical field and patients about sickle cell. and actually, show and explore, what exactly happens, and, a breakdown of all of that. So there are some really useful ways that people are kind of tapping into VR besides games and whatnot. Another thing too, and this ties into the Vision Pro, is that, it's the future of work, right? I mean, when you put on the headset, you have this experience. I know for me, I like to have set up the home screen so it's like you're in kind of like a cyberpunk future apartment, and you're doing your work, and if you could be able to sit in there and write just for, let's say, 6 to 8 hours or something, why even go to a cafe? You got your coffee at home, you put your VR
well,
headset
maybe
on,
that's the trick. Maybe that's what I got to do, right? Because because Katie's hinting at the fact that I only write in cafes.
This is true.
It's like my jam for writing, So
hey, it's good to be in real space once in a while.
Yeah, true.
Here's one area that I know is growing fast. During the pandemic, the airlines all laid off a lot of crew, and not just the flight attendants, but also the ground crew. So if you've been flying lately, and Brett, I know you've been flying around the world, you experience things like delays and lost luggage a lot more than you did back in 2019. And that's because the ground crew is often very new. They're new hires. Well, they're finding that with immersive training, if you use a VR headset, you can train people much faster and they retain it much better. And where that's particularly useful is repairing jet engines. So VR for the repair of jet engines. I know it's like super narrow and precise, but it affects everybody who flies. So it's actually something where we get the benefit of it, even if we're
those engines have like 1 million components, so super complex.
That's always the example they use when they talk about industrial metaverse, which is a category I'm super interested in. This is not the entertainment metaverse or the game metaverse, but the more practical reality of being able to see everything that's going on in a factory, or everything that's going on at, say, a complex place like an airport. These are hard things to visualize because they're three-dimensional. So an immersive media representation is actually quite it's a good way to indulge in that. Big area for my practice right now. I've been dealing with that on the city scale level now, in different cities across the U.S., building out city scale digital twins.
The complex smart city design stuff and things like that. There's going to be a whole lot of. I know it's off the track a bit, but talking to the Neom guys last week while I was in Dubai and so forth. We're really the big challenge right now is us developing operating systems for smart cities. Right? It's because you have to deal with all of these complexities, and there's going to be a ton of automation thrown at it. How do you, how would you organize transport at the line, for example? Because it's so long. Would you put a train in? Well, then it'd take like hours to get from one end to the other if you had regular station stops and things like that. So some of the design problems are pretty interesting.
The line city, it seems like a design nightmare. It's like if you want to get from one end to the other, it's the most difficult thing in the world. You're going to have to be.
But I think the point of the line, and again, this is where some of this emerging design thinking is coming for cities, is that you have these mixed use or multi-use zones and neighborhoods, and you don't need to go out of that zone unless you're traveling. So you would have a express version of a train, and then you'd have localized stops and things like that. But the whole idea is you can work, you can go to hospital, you can have your kids go to school, all within that mixed use zone. So
was it 5 to 15 minutes to get from one end to the line to the other? Because I think it's
but that's if you don't have any stops. Right. The problem is quite a long. If you have all those stops, that was the discussion that was going on. But I mean, look, this is we're starting to have to think about the world in a different way. That's what's really interesting about this. We're having to measure the world, describe the world, the digital twin concept, that's also making us think about how these systems are organized. And AI, one of the beauty of AI is it will be able to handle all of these complex systems like transportation, sanitation design, better resource and energy management than we can. But the issue with that is going to be we don't understand what the black box is doing necessarily. So it's a really interesting time to start thinking about large scale systems and how we represent data of that, how we can use the metaverse and Web3 for that. It's all really interesting stuff.
So Brett and Katie, I'm organized a conference on this very topic in Santa Fe, and it's happening on November 10 and 11. It's called Creative Experience, and it's where the digital world meets the real world. And it's all about this idea of large-scale systems thinking and how do we use technologies like AI and immersive media to make a better world. The reason we did it is really simple. Most of the folks I talk to are not that excited about artificial intelligence. Generally speaking, the people I talk to, particularly people who aren't in the tech industry, they look at it skeptically. They're like, here's just one more thing the tech industry's thrown at us. And that's not a great way to approach the future. On this show, we're always interested in the future and trying to give people different techniques or ways to think about the future. They're a little more constructive. I think you want to lean into these things. So I organized this event where people can learn about the technologies, people who are not from the tech industry, and then ask the question, how can we use this to make a resilient community better? So that's happening in Santa Fe. It's called CXSF, and it's happening on the 10th and 11th of November. And I'm very excited about this. Small group, highly participatory, with some outstanding speakers. So a lot of future thinking folks will be there on the 10th.
Cool.
Yeah, I've been inspired by you, Brett. I want to start to do more events now that the world is kind of coming back to life post-pandemic. And so the idea of getting together in the real world and not just doing everything by Zoom is on my agenda too.
Well, I can tell you, dude, my message is sharpening up, like because I'm having to present it and I'm having to handle, questions and stuff. And I'm just like, we've talked about it a lot, like and we might even have, what's his name, Giannis, whatever, these techno-feudalism book out. And, we're talking about these different, people are starting to think about different systems, different economic models, 20 years ago, if you'd suggested that, we're talking about late stage capitalism, it would have been, almost heresy, right? But now people are at least starting to entertain this sort of stuff. What sort of systems do we need moving forward? How is AI going to change that? Even the question of techno unemployment and things like that, it's getting a bit more acceptance that we are going to change the way we work very rapidly, and that's going to result in displacement. So we have to sort of think about that transition, So, yeah, it's an interesting time.
Wow, we covered a lot of stuff on the show. Crazy how we're pulling it all together.
We should do this more often, though. This sort of banter, and we should get Brian back on too.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Get the band back together. Thanks for Alex Tapscott. Always good to hear from him. Let's try to get him and his dad on a show in the future.
Yes.
And Katie, it's always great. Well, great. This has been a fun time to see all of you and tie these threads of AI and immersive media and Web3 and the decentralized web and blockchain all together. These appear to be like the building blocks of the future. And as slow as the progress might be, there are signs of progress. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you all for joining us. This has been a pleasure to have. I'm Rob Tercek. You've had my co-host, Brett King, and Katie, Miss Metaverse, joining us. What a pleasure to have you on the show. Big thanks to Kevin Hirschhorn for recording it, Elizabeth Severns, our producer, and the folks at Provoke Media who make the show possible. And of course, a big thanks to our audience, our listeners. You make the show possible as well. And by sharing it with your friends and telling people about the show, you help other people discover it. The audience has been growing and growing. And for that, we're really gratified. So thank you all very much. And we will come back to you next week with yet another futurist, because that's our mission. We're going to interview them all someday. And so I guess until then, we will see you. Here we go, everybody. See you in the
future.
We are never going to get the timing right on that.
It works. It's fun.
I tried.
It's fun. All right. See you, everyone.
All right.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.